There's something I've got to bring up before we begin. I greatly rely upon the Internet Archive for these monthly reviews because the Virgin New Adventures and the Eighth Doctor Adventures aren't as easily accessed as the ordinary BBC books. Unfortunately, just last week the site lost a hearing against four of the biggest publishers in the world over its right to digitally lend copies of books. They're still planning on fighting this, so I'm going to leave links in the description. Any support you could give them would be greatly appreciated. This goes well beyond my silly videos. There's so much information that will be lost if the archive goes down. It'll be catastrophic for writers and authors alike. Please join in the fight to help us preserve our libraries.
Hey, Jack.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
Pretty good. You ready for this?
Yeah, I'm really excited to collab on this with you, man. Really.
I have been so excited to talk about the greatest introduction to the Eighth Doctor possible.
Honest to God, I've been waiting years to talk about Storm Warning. Ben?
On a more positive note, yay! My introduction to Kate Orman. She's one of those Wilderness Years writers I've heard people rave about, like Lawrence Miles, Paul Cornell, and Jonathan Blum, who I'm not as familiar with, to my shame, but I've listened to Fearmonger, and I know he wrote that one, so he's also in my good books.
Our story begins when Totally Not Grace from the TV movie runs into the Doctor and Sam Jones in a bar in San Francisco in 1976 mid-vampire hunt. The Doctor leaves Caroline the means of contacting him again should she ever need his help. Cut to 21 years later, Caroline is a scientist living with her boyfriend James, and she looks into anything vampire-related in her spare time. She crosses paths with Unit, James gets kidnapped, so the Doctor and Sam return. From there, it's somewhat of a Silurian plot, only done with vampires. The Doctor works with their leader Harris to create a new artificial food source, as opposed to human smoothies. I've seen this story credited as the point where the writers worked out how they were actually going to characterize the Eighth Doctor going forward, mainly by actually giving him one. The TV movie spent a bit of time that it probably should have used to get us familiar with our new lead, killing off his predecessor. When 8 finally showed up, they gave him amnesia and mostly had him rant about the end of the world, which isn't so much a workable take on the Doctor so much as it's me in a bar on a Friday night. 8 Doctors used this hindsight excellently by making the same mistakes, only this time they didn't have McGann's performance to carry it. I was going to say that the 8 we're presented with here is the first appearance of a new Who Doctor, because it's difficult to think of a later incarnation that didn't take cues from him. There's 10's self-righteous anger that can disappear into a grin, 11's distractibility and turning up in the wrong order, even a dollop of 13. But here's one thing I believe no one has captured since. Revival Doctors make constant speeches about how important ordinary lives are, but more often than not, they're dismissive of domesticity. 8 is no such hypocrite. There's a bit at the start where Caroline tells him about what she's studying, the topic that you bring up in a party if you're trying to make someone leave you alone, but 8 gets really into it and hangs off her every word. This Doctor doesn't just find everything and everyone fascinating, he finds them all equally fascinating. He'll run around like Todd from BoJack Horseman, fixing relationships and arranging funerals whilst trying to save the world. I'd like to see something like this again. Maybe one week, Shooty just ignores an invasion, buggers off to help some random stranger with their gardening instead. But while we have a very childish and likeable Doctor, there's still a darkness to him. Kramer, a unit general who knew him back when he was 7, thinks she's still dealing with the same man. 8 surprises her, but there are moments that suggest there's more to him than meets the eye, and this time he might not even be aware of it. The magician metaphor is really interesting, because you're not sure how much he's making up as he goes along and how much he's planned well ahead of time. Are these magic tricks or actual magic? It's something we haven't gotten since really Troughton in Power of the Daleks.
New companion Sam Jones has also spent some much needed time back at the drawing board, and she's interesting now. I think it was a smart thing considering how weird the introduction was to cut till after they'd had a few adventures, her and 8. It's still early days, but they feel like they've got an established dynamic. And considering Orman is a V&A writer, and considering how similar, or at least somewhat similar, her background is to Ace, she could have very easily ended up as Ace 2.0, but I think what made it for me was kind of leading into how much of a natural she was at this life, and how weird that kind of makes her. She kind of reminds me of Valkyrie Kane from Skullduggery Pleasant. The characters all across the board really make this. You think Shackle's just going to be a broad comedy character, but no. And considering how well Caroline and James were written as a couple, it doesn't surprise me to find out that Orman and Blum are a real-life couple. That's just relationship goals. Actually, hold one sec. Hey, Zim. Do you want to write a Doctor Who novel with me? Hello? Zim?
Out of all of the books I've covered so far, this has the most on its mind thematically. Unfortunately here I'm going to have to briefly touch on mental health, suicide, and very, very briefly sexual assault. So a trigger warning for all the above. We learn that Dr. Shackle has, for months, been dealing with depression and suicidal thoughts because of the daily trauma that people in professions like his are exposed to. This picks up on the most interesting idea in the TV movie.
I'm half human.
No, not that one.
But it was a childish dream that made you a doctor. You dreamt you could hold back death. Isn't that true?
Is it possible to hold back death, or is it a childish dream? Shackle feels like he's fighting a losing battle against death. Even when he saves lives, that doesn't save his. He's tried pretending he doesn't care, but after another kid dies on his operating table, he gives up. He chooses to be turned, a beat somewhat reminiscent of the Buffy Season 2 episode Lied to Me, which aired the same year this came out. Immortality is used as an escape. Another vampire, Harris, compares the Doctor's travelling with avoidance. We see this with Caroline tempted to run off with the Doctor when a rift comes between her and James. But the novel rejects this as a solution. Shackle's Sisyphus situation is shared by the immortals. The vampires struggle with midlife crisis, they sometimes go insane trying to find meaning in living so long. It gets briefly tied in with Goth culture, with the Buddhist themes of the Pertwee era, and the Doctor's own search for enlightenment. And of course, the Doctor keeps giving the same answer to Shackle's problems. He gives the answer that any version of the Doctor would give.
You can't win. I know, and why not? Just at the end. Just be kind.
On top of all of this, vampire science deserves to be talked up as one of those few glorious examples of Doctor Who that, in my humble opinion, gets mental health right. I've mentioned Shackle, but a ways in, Sam gets bitten by a vampire and this really disturbs her. Not unlike Buffy's trauma at the start of Season 2 after she was bitten and killed by the Master. Now, these would have been written at similar times, so I'm not going to call Whedon unoriginal. There's so much worse things I could call him. It feels pretty apparent that Sam's bite is coded as sexual assault. Vampires go hand in hand with sexual horror, and this happens in a nightclub as well. I can only speak to my limited experience on this, but I do believe this aspect was well handled. It's not just done to motivate the Doctor, and we get her feelings and perspective on what's happened to her. We see what she's struggling with firsthand. As a result, I could not blame her one bit for wanting the vampires dead. This creates a real conflict between her and the Doctor. She contemplates leaving during this book. This is kind of something that became a bit of a tradition in New Who, where the second outing of a Doctor and companion really tests their relationship. This is one of the best examples of it, I feel.
I realise I'm adding nothing new here when I say that if you want to get into the EDAs, or you're just looking for a really good standalone Doctor Who book, this is a really good bet. Despite a merciless font size and layout that's exacerbated in my humble opinion on a PDF, and this one plot thread about cloning humans that I think the book forgets about, this is still an excellent read. A massive step up from the previous two novels. It feels like it's in conversation with them, and it hasn't just omitted everything that had potential. If you've been listening to me, you can tell this. It had an astounding amount of influence on what came later. It's narratively slender, but brimming with humanity and all sorts of interesting little touches. And it has vampire squirrels. Legally speaking, a book cannot be said to be bad if it contains vampire squirrels.
Oh, he's back. Oh, he's talking to me again then, is he?
Hi, Jack!
Oh, fuck.